Thank you so much for joining us on this week's Good News. I'm sitting down with Merrie Robin over at the Tennessee branch of International Dyslexia Association, which is quite a mouthful. So we're going to shorten it down to TNIDA. So Merrie Robin, can you tell us a little bit about the TNIDA and your role there, and what exactly you all do?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thanks for having me. And the first thing I think it would be great is to kind of clarify what is dyslexia, what our branch is for, and that is to support people who may have dyslexia. And a lot of people don't know what that is, but it's a specific learning disability that actually is neurological. It has to do with the brain. A lot of people think it's a visual impairment, but it's really not. It's more of a it's a word. It's a reading impairment. And so it comes from not being able to accurately or fluently decode or recognize words. So students with dyslexia, they often struggle with letters, the relationship between letters and sounds, and then because they have a hard time decoding and figuring out words. So a lot of times students with dyslexia are not diagnosed until they get to the third grade, because a lot of times they can hide it because they'll memorize words and they can't actually decode the sounds. And so they're not identified until almost the third grade, if they're identified at all. And study has showed this has affected like 1 out of 5 children. So it is but anyway, today what we want to talk about is there's a great resource that a lot of people aren't aware of that helps people that may have a child who's dyslexic or a teacher who has students who are dyslexic. And that is TNIDA, and that is a branch of a larger organization that's national called IDA, International Dyslexia Association. And almost all the states have their own branches, and ours is Tennessee, and it's divided up into across the state. We have area members on our board that service different areas, and I represent Area 1, our area, which is like the counties. There are, I think, there's 14 counties in our Area 1.
Okay.
And these, all the way from, Johnson to Unicoi, Claiborne County are included in this area. So if you ever had a question, you could contact the specific areas on the board. Yeah. And we do things to help people understand what dyslexia is, understand things, ways you can help your child.
Yeah. So with the dyslexia, so I was growing up, my mom told me, I had dyslexia, and because I was never diagnosed or anything. And I think this is, kind of been a difficult thing, but like sometimes I spell words backwards.
Yes.
And that's a big thing. Like there's times where I'll write and I don't even realize it. I'll write or I'll read a word backwards, and I'll read, like I'll see something and I'm like, okay, I'll read it. And then like right now I still do it too. My wife's like, what in the world? And I was like, that's that word. And then I'll look back at it and I'm like, oh no. Okay. I moved this. I'll like take the back end of the word and put it in the front. And that's how I read the word. And I don't know if that's, part of it, but what other symptoms as a parent now, I'm a parent of 3. What are some stuff to look out for to be like, hey, maybe my kid has dyslexia, should we see? Because, for me, I just, like you said, I just kind of pushed through, memorized the words, and just kind of dealt with terrible spelling.
Sure. That's a great question. And a lot of times, one of the myths, a lot of times kids can do it. I know when I didn't know anything about dyslexia, and I'm actually a parent of a child who is dyslexic, which is what you'll find a lot of our board members have gotten that way. They're professionals that are actually parents also that have children who are dyslexic. But reversals of B and D's is what a lot of people think that's all dyslexic is. And that can be true, but just because you reverse your B's and D's does not mean that you're dyslexic. And all dyslexic children don't necessarily reverse their B's and D's. A good bit of them do.
Yeah.
I'm actually a tutor to help students with dyslexia. And I'd say out of 6 children, I'd say 4 of them reverse their B's and D's, but not all of them. So, but back to your original question, A lot of times you'll find students, they will read words, and they can't decode even the most simplest, like 3-letter sound. Or they'll read like a big word like elephant, but then they won't be able to decode a word like bat, because they literally cannot make the connection between the individual sounds of the letters in order to form a word. So the word like elephant, they've memorized it by sight. So when they get to the reason that they can't catch them in the 3rd grade, what I say is they fall off the cliff, because there's so many words that they can't memorize the massive amount of words. So I remember when my child, I kept trying to figure out what was wrong with her. And I would say, it's like she's memorizing the words and she cannot decode any new word. And that's exactly what she was doing. She couldn't decode a word. A lot of times they have trouble with high frequency words with the memorization. Now that's not always, but a lot of times they do. And sometimes they have trouble with nursery rhymes. There are signs now that we can learn even when they're younger. That I wish a lot of teachers knew the signs to look for, the characteristics, and that way they could say, oh, this child needs more instruction in a phonics based, more explicit, detailed instruction on how to learn how to read, because you can help them as early as kindergarten and 1st grade before they fall off that cliff.
Yeah. So what are some other signs to look at? Because another thing, so I do my biggest struggles is that I spell that about 70% of the time backwards. I'll spell it backwards and not even realize it.
You've probably memorized it wrong.
Yeah. And then I also, if you read some of my writing, I will write, if I'm handwriting, I don't handwrite like any now, because like after I write it, someone will proofread it and was like, why is there 5s in here? I'll write the number 5 instead of S. And I do that about 50% of the time. And I'm like, I don't know why. I'll write 5. And I'm like, hold on, why is there a 5 in here? I don't know if that's part of it or not, or just. Yeah.
It could be. A lot of times there's a dysgraphia component. Some kids, some people, they have a hard time, because if you think about it, if it's neurological in nature, everybody automatically knows how to speak. That's a natural process, but reading is not natural. Everybody has to learn. So someone who's dyslexic, they actually have to develop new pathways to get from the back of your brain to the front, which is where normal people who read easily, they'll see there's more activity, but in dyslexic, there's not. And so to write, to spell is even harder than that, because there's even another process. You have to you have to figure out what that sound is, convert that sound into and actually make that letter onto a piece of paper. So that is very common, and makes it very, very difficult. And that's why a lot of kids that's another sign. If they have a really hard time with spelling, sometimes their handwriting is really bad because they have that dysgraphia problem. Yeah. I see that with some of my students, and so a lot of times we focus. I mean, in today there are accommodations that you can use, which is so great, because there are accommodations that students can use for speech to text. And that's probably what you do now. You just learn to compensate for it.
Spell check, thankfully, was invented. Yes, so if I'm texting, it just fixes everything for me. Yes. So, but yeah, those are all, that's very common. A lot of times if you have a child who doesn't ever want to read, they get upset when you call to read, or they say a lot because they're trying to read faster. That's another sign at younger ages. I know my child would do that, or they just fight you tooth and nail. They do not want to read. Yeah. Gotcha. So, okay.
Yeah.
So, and why, I mean, from my perspective too, being that I've, struggled with this my whole life, if you're to identify it earlier and maybe, get some resources on how to benefit, or how to kind of get back past these hurdles, what are some simple things that they can do, or some, really reasons why, like maybe if I, knew about this, or, did something a lot earlier, I wouldn't be so bad? Or is it something
Right.
that where, we can kind of, just get a little bit better at this at a younger age, instead of, me now being, speak to text and spell check and terrible handwriting at, 28 years old.
Right. Well, I think a lot of that has to do with helping teachers. We have a lot of great teachers, and I know that my child, that all the teachers that I've had, when I go to explain to them what she has, that she's dyslexic, they'll say, "I'll be about it," but they'll do anything they can to help her with accommodations. And so there are things that we can do when they're younger, and it has to do with how we teach them phonics. They have to, sometimes now, I don't know all exactly how we're teaching the kids to read, but sometimes they will use just use the text around, or to decode the word. Well, as someone who's dyslexic, they can't decode any of the words around the text. So they kind of, that's why Dyslexia Awareness, that's one of our, one of the passions of a lot of people on the board, is to try to help, even all the way into the universities, to help train teachers to recognize and to teach more of a phonics-based, explicit phonics instruction. And all students can learn from that, but even more, it helps those who struggle to read. Yeah. So it's not, if you think you have a child who's dyslexic, I would suggest that, or you think, hey, my child has trouble with some of these. They can't decode words. They don't talk, their speech is not fluent. They get things mixed up. They're very, slow to read. They fight me on reading. But hey, if I read it to them out loud, they understand exactly what the passage was about. Those are big signs of, okay, this child may have characteristics of dyslexia. Feel free to reach out to our board, okay, and I can give you a hotline for that. But as far as an easy fix as to what we could do, that's where the passion comes from, trying to help teachers understand these characteristics of dyslexia, and you can identify them earlier and give them the more explicit instruction that they need at the younger age. That's what I do with my students that I tutor, and my daughter had to go through tutoring, and that's why I became so passionate and saw how much it helped her. Yeah. And became, got certified to be a tutor myself with the program that she uses, and I use the same program for my students. But it's not easy, because it's kind of like they almost have to relearn how to read. You have to, but it's a very specific, ordered process. That's where, if they learned how to do that when they were in kindergarten, it would be easier for them.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely didn't. And I ended up being pulled out of school. Was it fourth grade? I believe I was so far behind, and that it wasn't getting any better. And, so at that point, it was like, my mom was like, he can't continue this. So, she pulled me out. And then after that, I was, homeschooled until junior year of high school, and which worked great because I could kind of learn at my own pace. And once I understood a lot of it, and honestly, in today's society, English, spelling, all that stuff isn't as, because you have all these other resources. It's like I have talk to text, I have spell check. So all that stuff I can, at least be better at, instead of, when I was younger and we didn't have that, it was handwritten. Everything's, you writing it down, and when for me, if I'm trying to be, make sure I'm spelling everything correctly, if I'm trying to take notes, I'll be writing one word, and, my wife, on the other hand, is phenomenal, and she's like 3 paragraphs in, and I've done a couple words. So it's like, trying to just really pay attention, you can't very easily.
No, you
So
can't. And I think a lot of, I know for me as a parent and also for my child, just knowing what the problem was
mhm,
as to why it was so hard
yeah,
for her to read was it was almost like a relief when we finally figured it out. Yes,
yeah,
it was a lot of work and still it's not fun. She doesn't want people to necessarily know that,
yeah,
because being dyslexic does not mean that you have a lack of intelligence. As a
yeah,
matter of fact, there are a lot of people, famous people who, I mean, Albert Einstein,
hmm,
a lot of actors have dyslexia. They've just figured out ways to overcome them because a lot of sometimes would say that kids with dyslexia, they have other superpowers.
yeah,
Uh, they're really good. They may be really good at sports. They're really good at figuring out the big picture because they've had to figure out how to compensate with their disability
yeah,
because they're intelligent. They're very intelligent. They just have their brain is just wired differently
yeah,
for reading. So they have to figure out a different way to do that.
hmm,
And I always tell parents, don't be afraid and don't be ashamed to use accommodations for kids. There's no reason for them to use all of their all their brain power to decode a word because they may never be able to decode a word fast enough and miss the whole point of the social studies or science
yeah,
lesson.
yeah,
Because they're supposed to be learning social studies and science and they can learn that as well as anybody. Let them listen to it out loud.
yeah.
Let them learn to use those accommodations.
Hmm.
So,
Well, and what are some accommodations for? I know in like when I was in college, you have a lot more stuff that you're able to do. So I'd actually audio record
yes,
full college classes. So then I could go back and re-listen to it all because I do a lot better listening than
yes,
trying to take notes. But what are some stuff? I mean, elementary school is not as you can't just hand your kid a recorder that I know of, at least. But what are some accommodations that maybe that schools offer if you are? Because I think there is like you have to be officially diagnosed with it to get some. I know in college that was the case. If you were officially diagnosed with something, then you would get like a little extra time on the test or a different test, like a oral test instead of a written test. Is there accommodations like that for kids in elementary school? Is that something
yes,
parents can talk with the school about, or?
yes. So the first thing to get the diagnosis is that's a whole nother, probably a whole nother session.
Yeah.
Um, but there is a state dyslexia law now. If you think
Okay.
your child has dyslexia, you can ask by law, your school is required. If you ask and say, I would like screened for characteristics of dyslexia
Okay.
and specifically ask for characteristics of dyslexia, then they are by law are required to test your child. And so they will
Okay.
give them a test like rapid naming, phonemic awareness, that's the
Hmm.
sounds, um, things like that. And they will do that. And um, then they can give you something called a 504 or an IEP.
Okay.
So,
Okay. I've heard of
and
the
there,
IEP.
yes, and so that's where you can ask for accommodations, and you list out accommodations that they would need in the classroom. And
Okay.
accommodations can be things such as extended time, like
Hmm.
time and a half for tests, or sometimes students who are dyslexia, since they have so much, and it takes so much, brain power,
Hmm.
cognitive ability to just read or process what they're trying to, do. They need a quiet place,
Yeah.
somewhere that's got less distractions when they're taking a test. That's another type of accommodation. You asked specifically about text to speech or speech to text, and there are programs. Most of the schools now provide Chromebooks or
Yeah.
laptops, and there are ways to get Google Documents, Apple, all of these
Hmm.
things. They will to read to you.
Okay.
But I'm not the expert in that. We
Yeah.
have someone on our board who's very good at that, a man
Okay.
down in Knoxville, and he's actually dyslexic, and his passion is accommodations
Yeah. That's cool.
for students, and let them use this as early as possible so that they don't have to fall behind in
Yeah.
their grade level.
Definitely.
Um, but and we've had our board has had lots of great speakers on
Hmm.
accommodations. That's another thing that we do is we offer seminars or speakers. We bring in, and we
Okay.
have done in the past. We've done live events these last
Mhm.
2 years, and this next year we're going to do
Yeah.
it virtual again, which actually makes it easier for this area because
Yeah.
we're in East Tennessee. If you think about the whole state of Tennessee, where would you normally have a conference? Nashville area.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it to me it works out great when we do
Yeah.
things virtually because it's more convenient.
For sure.
Um, but it but we've had speakers that there are people who are experts on that. Another easy thing that I have done, my child uses a lot, is Learning Ally, and that has a lot of library books, a lot of books that your child may want to read that will read them out loud to you.
Okay.
And
So
she will use that all the time.
Learning Ally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Ally. Yeah.
ALL. Okay. Can
Why?
you send
Learning
me,
Ally.
is it like a website or an app? Is that what that is?
It's an app. It's an
Okay.
app.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then as far as like resources and stuff, because you've talked a lot about, like the conferences, speakers, um,
Mm-hmm.
what is, maybe like if someone, thinks their kid might have dyslexia, what are some resources for them as far as websites, apps and stuff? And we can link that in here as well so that people can, if you're listening right now, you can get the website and all this information
Right.
afterwards as well. So you don't have to try to remember everything.
So our website for TNIDA is just www.tnida.org.
Okay.
Okay. And it will link you to other websites, the big International Dyslexia Association. It will link you to that. We also have a hotline that you can call if you have specific questions.
Okay.
And that is 1-877 TENNIDA.
Okay. Yeah, I'll put the link to this stuff in the description here as well. So then we'll have that. And then what was that app called again? For the reading?
Oh, Learning Ally, ALLY.
Okay. Yeah, I'm writing that stuff down. I'll put that stuff in there just because it is really important to identify it earlier. Because, like you said, there is kind of like that cliff at third grade, which is what I hit because
Yes.
after third grade, my mom pulled me out so that she could kind of. Which I mean, my mom she has her master's in English and education, and my dad has his master's in math and history or something. So my parents were teachers and went to school for that and everything. So it was really beneficial. But I think if they were to left me in at that point, I would have been held back a year or two, or just because I couldn't keep going because I didn't, kind of have the foundation, that you need. So it's really important to identify this early. So I want to make sure we have those resources available for everyone.
Yes.
And yeah, that's awesome though. All right.
Yeah. It's really neat. I didn't know that you are probably dyslexic. I don't know if you've ever had an official diagnosis, but it sounds very.
That's what I've always been told. Just because of where I was just so far behind in reading and. Like even that, which it's funny. I in high school, I even past the couple years when I had in high school, I didn't read very much. Once I got a hold of audiobooks, though, the first year that I discovered audiobooks, I listened to 54 audiobooks that year because it was like I loved it and I could go because my reading wise, if I'm reading a book, if you're talking out loud, like if you're reading out loud, that's the fastest I can read in my head. If I try any more, I won't read it. I'm just skimming through. I catch a couple words here and there. But after I'm done, I'm like, I have no idea what I read. So it's like reading. I am going for this. So listening out loud, I can listen, 1.5 speed and knock out a book in a day.
Yes.
So
And so
it's good.
you are a great example of yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
that's exactly why I said don't ever hesitate. If your child is dyslexic and they're getting it, they can learn to read, but they may never learn to read as quickly as what they need, at those higher levels of classes
yeah.
or books. But don't keep them from those.
Yeah.
Let them listen out loud. And I used to never could get my child to read.
Yeah.
Never. They wouldn't read because it's just too much work.
Oh yeah.
And once we did the Learning Ally, the reason I like that app is because it has different voices that you can get on it.
Oh, that's cool.
Now, there are other apps. I'm sure there's lots of things that you can do. But that's the one I know that my daughter uses.
Yeah.
And so.
Definitely. That's awesome. I appreciate you, Merrie Robin, just coming on and sharing everything that TNIDA is doing. And I really hope this raises awareness for dyslexia, because it is something which thankfully now there is more resources. When I was younger, it just wasn't the case. It was like, well, you got to do this or you fail. So sorry. But now you can, have those resources in the school. If you're concerned that your kid might have dyslexia, you can just ask your school, like, hey, can you test them to make sure? Because that's huge right there. If your kid's kind of falling behind a little bit or struggling with reading and getting stuff backwards, then it can definitely help.
A lot of times, the parents are the ones who recognize, they know, because they know there's something wrong.
Yes.
Like, probably your parents, as being an English teacher or math teacher, your mom is probably like, something's not right.
Yeah.
Sometimes a teacher might recognize, but they also have so many other students. But a mom or a dad, when they listen to a child read, and especially if they have several and they know this child is working, that's what I would say. She's working way too hard to read what she's reading, or she won't read, So
yes, I did not read.
You have a concern. Don't hesitate to try to figure out why and ask, because the earlier the better.
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, I really appreciate you coming on the show and just sharing your heart behind TNIDA and what you all are doing there. So it's definitely good. It's definitely good news.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you.